What's up, everybody? Welcome to Bandwagon Banter Broadcast, where we berate, belittle, or behold the best bandwagons on the Binternet. I really f***ing hate that joke. So, with that being said, let's take a look at what the internet wants to jump on top of today. Jesus Christ, I'm in for a long ride. Every game company or series has been at the center of controversy for a shoddy title at some point in time. Whether it's something trivial like a passing fad or a monumental failure, every company will inevitably find themselves under the scrutiny from people who don't even know how to spell the word scrutiny. Very rarely do you have a company that manages to defy this expectation. If it's not the company that faces scrutiny, it's the series. And if it's not the series, it's the lack of that series. Please, Nintendo, I'm begging you! However, Naughty Dog is one of those companies that seem to have dodged the subject of controversy, consistently pumping out groundbreaking title after title, with the primary negative reception of their games being that it plays too much like a movie. Naughty Dog played around with some smaller titles in their early years, but as soon as Crash Bandicoot came out, Naughty Dog set the bar and kept pushing the boundaries of what video games are capable of every single year. Crash Bandicoot pushed the boundaries of level design and showed how much personality you can put in the 32 bits of hardware. Jak and Daxter was one of the first big games where you can explore everywhere seamlessly with no loading times or fog bogging down the environment. Uncharted truly felt like you were playing an interactive movie and showed us how much we hate being told what f***ing button to press. Each of these games followed Naughty Dog's design philosophy of pushing the boundaries and setting precedents not only for Sony, but for the entire video game industry as well. So when The Last of Us came out, it was monumental! The Last of Us truly showed that you can create realistic, Oscar-worthy characters on a game console. Following the shoes of Joel and Ellie, we got a heart-wrenching story about a pessimistic father escorting an optimistic girl on a journey to save the world. A pretty cliche story, but the game truly set the bar for every single story-driven game after it as a basis of how to create realistic, memorable characters in video games. So when we saw the Firefly logo on The Last of Us Part 2 in December 2016, Sony's fanbase lost their f***ing minds. The Last of Us Part 2, Sony's blue ball for nearly the entirety of the PlayStation 4's lifecycle. Sony kept releasing teaser after teaser, and this show of an E3 press conference, slowly sprinkling bits of gameplay to show us and say, hey guys, we're still here. Sony's reveals and development updates on The Last of Us Part 2 continue to leave fans anxious to see how the saga of Ellie and Joel would continue following the open to interpretation cliffhanger. So in September 2019, we finally got a release. Alright, is this it now? June 19th, 2020, The Last of Us Part 2 released for PlayStation 4 to, for lack of a better word, Division. Critics lauded The Last of Us 2 as game of the generation, even better than the original, setting the bar even higher for video game developers. And fans stated that it was an absolute atrocity and one of the worst games ever okay, maybe it's not that bad. Now, I'll be honest, I didn't get this game on initial release. I usually wait and play PlayStation exclusives when they have a small price drop. But all the controversy surrounding The Last of Us 2, I went to GameStop and picked up a copy, and what can I say? I can see where the criticisms of this game comes from. The Last of Us 2 does what the original Last of Us does best, breaking classic tropes and subverting the expectations of the player. With the first Last of Us, we ended the game with Joel being the villain, essentially dooming humanity and giving into his own self-interest. It's an excellent way for the developers to have the players reflect on what they would do if posed with the same situation. However, the problem I have with The Last of Us Part 2 is I'm not sure what the hell it's trying to do here. After playing through the entirety of The Last of Us Part 2, I have a ton of questions. Some answered and most unanswered, and I gotta be honest, I was fairly disappointed in this game. But don't skip away just yet. I've watched dozens of reviews and in-depth analyses of these games, and it always ends in either two ways. This game is God's greatest gift to man, or this game looks like my high school yearbook photo. But I like to give every game a fair chance, and I think I found out why this game left such a bad taste in fans' mouth. So let's start out with the good. Naughty Dog had one sole expectation for The Last of Us Part 2 during development. Real life is the bar, and that is evident especially in its gameplay. I remember watching the E3 2018 showcase for the first time and being absolutely blown away. The worlds here were so much more expansive, the cutscenes looked gorgeous and more realistic than ever before, and as soon as I saw the glass breaking, I thought, is this really what it looks like to break a window? The Last of Us Part 2 takes place in Seattle, and this looks amazing. If you look at these environments and blink, you could mistake them for an actual movie. The textures, the lighting, the facial recognition software, I always appreciate that Naughty Dog takes the highly civilized areas and makes them feel fleshed out and realistic. They did this in the original, and they replicated it in Uncharted 4, so it's nice to see them implement it here. And especially in Abby's story, this segment where they're roaming through the mess hall and we get to see how the civilization is thriving in a post-apocalyptic realistic world, it's one thing for Naughty Dog to give us a background, but an environment that has its own story with plenty of small conversations in the background, the level design doesn't make you feel stripped from the game, it only adds. And the combat is such a step forward as well. The crafting system has been copied over from the original because, I mean, why mess with perfection? While adding more customization options that feel more integrated in the overworld. You can get these training manuals that can teach you new skills, save combinations that, granted, can be frustrating sometimes, but grant you new upgrades and story lore to the world. But then they added this grappling hook and motorboat that gave us new creative ways to explore Seattle? Like, Naughty Dog, why wouldn't you have brought in the grappling hook more? It's so damn good! I love seeing these areas where the game challenges me to find more creative ways to progress through the levels. It's by far the most fun part in Uncharted 4. I just wish you would have done it more here. In addition to gameplay elements, you can't talk about The Last of Us 2 without talking about this guitar minigame section. I don't know, you play guitar in the game. Finally, I can live out my dream. The game has this beautiful moment between Ellie and Dina and shows this passion is picked up, bridging the connection between Ellie and Joel. It's a great sign of symbolism that needs no explanation, but I really appreciate that when Ellie picks up the guitar, it accurately replicates the chords on an actual guitar and shows more than just the main 7 chords. And these cutscenes with Joel were probably my favorite part of the entire storyline. After each day, we get these flashbacks that show the progression between Ellie and Joel's relationship, the highs and the lows. The museum scene is an emotional roller coaster, cementing Ellie as Joel's, surrogate daughter? I don't fucking know, before they rip that out from underneath you and Ellie figures out the truth later on in the main story. But the thing that hooks me the most about this game was the acting, and I'm not just looking at Ashley, Troy, and Laura, I'm talking about the NPCs. To start, these clicker sounds are frightening. When directing the cast to mimic clicker sounds, they wanted the actors to truly bridge the gap of a sentient being crying out while still trapped in a cordyceps-ridden body. And when you hear a clicker coming towards you, you truly feel it, and I still stay up at night thinking about this. Alongside that, when moving around and traversing the world, you don't get these simple-minded enemies that are just there for placement. These characters have names, they have stories, they actually interact with each other and crack jokes on their day while on patrol. Enemies actually work together to locate you in ways that I've never seen before in a video game, and they don't forget or don't give up the fight even minutes after fighting. And some of these enemies are truly a challenge in one-on-one battles, or when they release dogs onto you, and these things are just a bitch to fight, no pun intended. Except for the one in Abby's story. Not Alice, but Bear. Bear is one of the dogs that you can play with in the beginning of Abby's story, and it's such a relaxing, wholesome change of pace from the storyline until you're playing as Ellie, and you kill the dog, and this girl yells. Now, I didn't notice this initially, but found it on social media when other people brought it to light, and I love this attention to detail. Except, how am I gonna recognize this dog that I killed until I've actually already met it? And that leads me to my first issue with the game. Pacing is one of those aspects in games that you don't usually notice until it's apparent. If a game is well paced, the thought doesn't cross your mind, but when a game does something stupid, you truly end up feeling torn apart from the experience. The Last of Us 2 starts out strong, piecing together the questions left unanswered from the 5-year gap. Ellie and Joel have made their way back to Jackson County and are currently residing with Tommy at the Resistance Camp, which has now become a full-fledged civilization. Though not as iconic as the original, the game takes us back to the atmosphere and does a great job at introducing these new characters, Dina and Johnny, which I'll talk about later on. Despite being a bit drawn out, I never felt bored of my time or forced to carry on with a mission. I especially love that within the first 2 hours of the game, you get to play as Joel and Abby. This is great! I'm sure this isn't foreshadowing to some tragic event that's about to- Yeah, I didn't know how people didn't see this coming. During promotion, we saw this ferocity and anger seething from Ellie and a large absence of Joel, so it was fairly obvious that Joel was going to meet his unfortunate demise, especially since... Yeah, I'd be pretty pissed off too. However, the intensity of this scene was truly gruesome and cements the anger we're trying to feel towards Abby. But I mean, come on, we know plotlines in AAA games aren't that simple. While not being afraid to nail the savagery here, if I had to make one complaint about this scene, it's that I don't think I can play golf anymore with this on my conscience. Most of the game's controversy stems directly from this scene. With fans' intimate connection towards Joel, it's obvious that people would be upset at this new Abby character. So I finished the remaining 95% of the game when I can voice my opinions online. But unlike a lot of people, I'm going to review the entirety of this experience as I do with every single game I've ever played, as long as it doesn't look like this. Ironically, right after this is where the pacing of the game starts to fall apart. See, the original Last of Us paced its game using a seasonal cycle. Each season would tell a different series of events, winter having the darkest story and spring showing the glimmer of hope. The Last of Us 2 takes a much less metaphorical approach, as arcs are separated into days, each day with their own series of memorable events. But where The Last of Us 2 falls flat is primarily due to the two lead characters Ellie and Abby. As you probably already know, the game proceeds for 3 days before the climactic encounter between the two. And Ellie's story is very slow paced. In my personal experience, I wasn't hooked by any key story elements. So let's take a look at the big picture. Ellie is driven by one goal: kill Abby. If that goal is not built up, the ultimate satisfaction falls flat. If that goal takes too long, we as the player feel disconnected. The first day's pacing is used as a lore building mechanic, meant to capture the breadth of this open world. Naughty Dog tries to encourage exploration with small notes and trinkets scattered throughout Seattle. However, I felt this felt way too long and ultimately felt more like a chore to trudge through. I think this is primarily due to the lack of story elements and standout characters being introduced. See, the first game kept throwing new characters, whether it be Sam or David, to keep the world full and fresh, but without characters to connect with in Ellie's story, the environment starts to get lonely.
Trust me, I know.
Although, the game did draw me back at the end of the first day. Throughout its day transitions, The Last of Us follows a series of flashbacks, slowly filling in the gaps left open during the 5-year span between titles. The cutscenes following Joel and Ellie kept me occupied during the 3-day span, and were honestly the most fulfilling and rewarding parts of the game for me. During the second day, we finally get a lead on Abby's location, but you know as well as I do, she's not gonna be there when we get there. Since the game has already shown its pacing for the first day, it's kinda safe to assume that she won't be there, and correct we are! The game does start to pick up at this point though, slowly taking out Abby's friends one by one, attempting to locate her, and introducing Seraphites, the religious cult that shows up for 2 seconds in Ellie's story and never shows up again until halfway through Abby's. Kinda don't have to explain the pacing on that one. Inherently, having 2 separate storylines that merge together isn't necessarily a bad thing. We've seen these in games before, like Sonic Adventure 2.
Are you really comparing The Last of Us 2 to Sonic the Hedgehog?
Yes, but let me explain. With a game like Sonic Adventure 2, while we see the main story unfold, characters are constantly crossing each other's paths and filling in the holes left behind by the other story. However, in The Last of Us 2, there's no real holes to dig or even questions to ask. The connection of the two stories are the same. The climactic parts of Ellie's story are the killing of Abby's friends, while the most important key moments in Abby's story are the discovery of those dead friends. Although an argument can be made for Eleven Yara's inclusion, I have no complaints here, A+ job. But the decision to kill Abby's friends first, the mystery and realization of how she comes across her deceased comrades ultimately undermines her story. We already know the sequence of events and how each body came to be, so where's our sense of shock? And how do we achieve a sense of grief? And most importantly, why would I waste my time connecting to these characters if I ultimately understand the fate of what these characters are going to go through? And that leads me to my second point. Motivation is debatably the most important part of not only video games, but anything you do in life. Would you continue watching this movie if you're not entertained? Would you start doing dishes if you got laid?
God, I sure hope so.
The same rings true for video games. Sometimes the motivation is seeing how the saga ends, how the characters find their sense of clarity, and other times it's the sheer fun or skill that keeps you motivated. The Last of Us has a deep problem with motivation for both of its stories. Abby's story primarily focuses on flipping the script and posing her as a hero, as the whole game we've seen her as the enemy. By showing her more compassionate side that she shares with her friends and allies, we see that she genuinely cares about these characters within her story. But if all of her friends have met with an unfortunate fate, that raises a good question. Why should I fucking care? Why should I care about what happens to Nora if she's already dead? Why should I worry about Mel and Owen if they're just gonna die? The only character I can truly care about is Lev and Yara, and even then, they don't come in until halfway through the second day. Now, you can't force an affinity towards every character, as not everybody's gonna like every character that they see, except maybe Kirby. I mean, seriously, have you ever seen somebody that hates Kirby? As a developer, you can only do as much as you can to enhance that character's emotion. So what if you don't care about Abby as a character at all? On the contrary, what if you don't care about the actions that Ellie is taking? Since both title characters are the only ones left standing in this cinematic battle royale, if you have a strong disdain for one of the characters, you're essentially stuck with them for almost half the game. And if you don't agree with the concept of revenge and the actions that Ellie is taking, can you really feel motivated to avenge Joel's death? If you're like me and ultimately know how Abby's story will end, how can you care about Abby's? Now that's not to say that gameplay or an accomplishment can't be your motivation. The gameplay is fairly top-notch, despite it being a more simplified version of the typical stealth mechanic we've seen in games like Metal Gear Solid. Rich gameplay can be a sense of motivation, however the gameplay takes up the smallest section of the game. The game is roughly 25 hours long, with a total amount of 5 hours taking up the gameplay. Not a lot of room to capture an audience if you ask me. If your story falls flat and you lose the player's motivation to move forward, you've ultimately failed at making the player feel attached to the game. As the player character in a story-driven game, we tend to gravitate towards either the overall plot or a specific character. Now in regards to specific characters, I haven't really talked about Dina much. I mean, she's an integral part of Ellie's story. However, in my personal opinion, she's kinda just there. For me personally, it seemed like Dina didn't integrate into the story at all, acting more like a second set of eyes for the characters to peer through. So what is Dina's motivation? Tommy's is the same as Ellie's. Jesse's is to bring Ellie back? Yeah, I found this character very forgettable, but that's beside the point. Dina is one of the 3 main characters of the game, but never really amounts to anything. Dina doesn't really bring anything to the table, and in the words of Ellie,
well, you're a burden now, aren't you?
God, I love a good cat fight.
I wish I had more to say about Dina, but she never really amounts to anything besides her plot point being a pregnancy. Apologies to all the Dina stands out there. I feel like she was placed in as a plot point for Ellie to start a family and have her happy ending, which leads me to my final point. Nothing upsets me more in a video game than when I feel like the plot is forcing itself to be different for the sake of being different. A game should feel natural and try its best to make sense within its environment. Take this year's Final Fantasy VII Remake. I felt totally stripped from this experience because as someone who hasn't played the original game at all, I had no prior knowledge to Sephiroth, and the game did not provide me with any of that knowledge because Sephiroth is completely irrelevant to the events of Midgar. The Last of Us 2 has plenty of moments like these that I like to refer to as forced plot points. First saw Mel at the beginning of the game, I was intrigued. We haven't seen a post-apocalyptic character dealing with pregnancy, so I was curious to see how it would be handled. Shortly thereafter, however, we learn that Dina is also pregnant, and this plot twist, rather than leave me speechless, left me saying, really? Expanding on this, why is Mel leaving on a mission while 8 months pregnant? Seriously, what guard is gonna let her out the door? These moments feel littered throughout the story. Why in the middle of a pivotal moment of self-reflection does Abby seek joy in wanting to kill pregnant Dina? Why does Ellie at the last second say, take my life instead? Why does this scene f***ing exist? With scenes like this, it's no secret that The Last of Us 2 wanted to be a truly progressive game that broke the mold, and for the most part, it makes sense within the context of the story. It's not often that we see a game with a female lead, and there's a diverse cast of characters across all backgrounds. Journalists wrote articles about how fans were offended by the inclusion of lesbian and transgender characters. Here's a list of people that actually were offended. But one progressive decision that I can't agree with comes at the end of the game. Ellie and Dina return to the small farm and finally get to have their happy ending, or so we thought. We are then shown Ellie now suffers from PTSD, which stands for pretty terrible story development. After watching Joel die, Jesse dying, every single person that she's killed, not just in this story but over the past 5 years dying, now she suffers from PTSD and has to go on this wild goose chase with no leads. Forced plot points. The game could have ended here perfectly, but the developers wanted to give clarity to Abby, or at least that's what I think. During this climactic final battle between Ellie and Abby, there's truly no aggression from Abby. She's come full circle and wants to live her life, moving forward from the mistakes that she's made in her past. It's an excellent end to Abby's story, but by servicing Abby's story, we're doing a disservice to Ellie's story. Fans were disappointed when Ellie couldn't finish what was started in the game's final moments, and to be honest, I don't blame them, because I truly don't even know how I feel. Do I hate that Ellie and Abby faced life-altering decisions that none of us could have truly fathomed in this fictional post-apocalyptic world? Or do I long for a sense of clarity and a definitive end to both stories? Although I've beaten this game into the ground with words of criticism, I think that's what makes this game so beautiful, which leads me to this. Neil Druckmann, the director and writer of The Last of Us Part 2, states that he'd rather players passionately hate this game than say it was just okay. And I completely agree. I'd rather people passionately hate my opinions on topics than just say, yeah, my videos are okay, because then we can discuss. We can self-reflect and have in-depth conversations about what makes us tick. We can open each other's eyes and form new opinions, change our outlooks. Hell, in a few months or years, I might come back to this game and love how the game was portrayed. And that's the beauty of it all. Some people might have an intimate connection with Dina based on their own personal personal experiences. Other players might suffer from PTSD and can truly connect with Ellie's ending much better than I did because they've been there before. Except hopefully not, because she's killed a lot of people. But at the end of the day, how we interpret the game can show us a lot about what we like and don't like about different subjects, and I think we can all agree that this game does an excellent job at making the player think. Despite my heavy criticisms, I don't think this is a bad game. I do think that this game had a lot of major decisions that steered it in the wrong direction. I feel swapping between Ellie and Abby between days would have been an excellent change of pace and leave the player with stronger anticipation of when they'll finally cross paths, but at the end of the day, I feel this game left me disappointed? I'm still not entirely sure. Maybe I need to truly feel disappointment to see if this game makes me feel the same way. I did ask for disappointment. How are you gonna miss every single thing? How are you going to bounce all the way and hit my laptop?